The title of today's message is A Lesson in World History. My sixth grade history teacher, Coach Olson, he was at that time, he was the linebackers coach for the Children's Bobcats, and he was the head baseball coach. And now he is the defensive coordinator for the Bobcats, and just a very special man to me. He taught Texas history in such a way that it made it come alive. He shared such intricate details about lives and occurrences and situations. The Alamo was a great time walking through that. He's a very gifted man, a very gifted coach and teacher. And then later in high school, I had him for government. And he's one of the main reasons that there at Texas Tech, I attained a degree in history and then a minor in poli-sci, political science. And I can trace it back to his teaching, and specifically his teaching in history. There's a great intrigue about history, about being able to look back behind us and to dissect events that occurred and the different people that were involved, and to look at those things and attempt, as historians would tell you, to learn from history. Now, all that to say that Daniel chapter 11 is unique, because in Daniel chapter 11, God teaches Daniel a lesson in history, but it's of events of which have not yet to occur, and about people that are not even yet born. So God is giving Daniel a prophecy, but yet he's giving him a lesson in history, what will occur, but it yet has not occurred. I just thought Daniel chapter 9 was the most difficult of all the chapters until I get into Daniel chapter 11. Now, just for reference to go back this afternoon or this week in your study of Daniel, and I appreciate those of you that have mentioned and comments about Daniel in this study and how you've enjoyed it and how you've learned and being able to take that into your lives. And those of you who read ahead each week, if you want to go ahead, of course, we'll conclude next week with Daniel chapter 12. But in your further study of Daniel chapter 11, look back to Daniel chapter 8. Because Daniel chapter 8 is really the conception, the part of this idea, the discussion about the ram, the he-goat, the four horns, and the little horn. Well, Daniel chapter 11 is fleshing that out in detail, in great minutia. Daniel chapter 11 breaks out into two different sections. So I want you to think with me as we consider this lesson in world history, two main sections. The first section is verse 1 all the way through verse 35. We'll actually pick it up in verse 2 today, but verse 1 all the way through verse 35. Now, in these 35 verses, there is a span of years that's covered, a prophecy. God is speaking through his angelic messenger to Daniel, telling him what is going to happen to his people, God's people, from the years 539 BC all the way down to 164 BC. So verses 1 through 35 cover 539 BC all the way down to 164 BC. Verses 36 through 45 cover future events that have not yet occurred. So what I want to do is break into these two sections. We'll go about it in a little bit different way. I'll read the sections as we go along, and I'll break even section 1 into subsections. We'll read a subsection, then we'll dissect those verses, move quickly to the next subsection, and then we're working our ways to the main crux of Daniel chapter 11, which is the teaching about the Antichrist who is yet to come in verses 36 through 45. That'll be of particular interest to you. The previous 35 verses have happened. Verses 36 through 35 will happen, will concern the capital T, the Antichrist, capital A, the Antichrist, and the Battle of Armageddon. So let's begin our discussion of the Persian Empire all the way through 164 BC, Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes. And let's begin in verse 2 of Daniel chapter 11. Verse 2 through 4. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia. Then a fourth will gain more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will arise and arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. Verse 3. And a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. But as soon as he is arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out towards the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants, nor according to his authority which he wielded, for his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others besides him. So in verses 1 and 2, he speaks and refers to the ram, the ram of chapter 8. That is the Medo-Persian Empire. And specifically here, he fleshes it out and he says, Daniel, I'm going to tell you the truth. I'm going to tell you exactly how it's going to happen. Mind you, these things are going to happen later. And he says 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia. So 3 additional Persian kings will arise, but then a fourth Persian king will arise and be greater than them, because he will have gained riches and assembled riches, and he will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. Now I want to share with you, as we walk through these verses, I'm going to give you the parallel secular history, because what it does, it brings out the amazing element of God's precise prophecy hundreds of years before. And now we can look back and see how history actually testifies to the prophetic nature of these verses. So verses 1 and 2, these kings, actually they did have 3 more Persian kings. They were listed there. And then the fourth one is King Xerxes. King Xerxes. Think Esther, the same king there that you see in Esther. King Xerxes. King Xerxes ruled from 486 to 465 BC. Now, just a note real quick. You know, when we talk AD, with the Roman calendar, we begin with 1 and then we go to where we're at now. BC, commonly referred to as before Christ, it works differently. So when I say the 6th century BC, it's actually talking backwards about the 500s. So if you say 6th century BC, it actually means the years 500 all the way through 599. So that's why it works backwards. Here's King Xerxes is the fourth king who will gain far more riches than all of them. Secular history testifies that King Xerxes from 486 BC to 465 BC was extremely wealthy. He prepared 4 years. For 4 years, he prepared to attack Greece. And this is, you can find more elements of King Xerxes in Esther chapter 1, verses 1 through 12. Now, moving on to verse 3, and a mighty king will arise. Now this is the he-goat. Remember the he-goat that doesn't even touch the ground, that's just burning rubber from the west. He's coming out of nowhere. This is the he-goat. The mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. This is Alexander the Great. And his years of reign were from 336 to 323 BC. And he actually did divide to the 4, his kingdom was divided to the 4 winds of heaven. That refers to the 4 generals that came after him. There was 4 generals that came after. It was a little bit of working out. We'll see that momentarily. But 4 generals came after him and took his kingdom to the 4 winds of heaven. You'll see that, the 4 points of the compass in the middle of verse 4. Now notice this, very interesting. Verse 4, the latter part of verse 4, though not to his own descendants. So Alexander, as quickly as he rose in great power, he fell. And this will happen often, you'll see through the history of times. These great kings, these mighty emperors and dictators, all these people that think they've got the whole world figured out and below, God raises them up and he sets them down like that. He does so with Alexander the Great, who at a young age, early 30s, had conquered the entire known world. And before long, he's just done. He's depressed, he's done, drinks himself to death, he's over, right? God sets him up and sets him down. And as he sets him down, he gives that kingdom to 4 generals. And not to Alexander's own descendants, nor according to his own authority. Alexander did have descendants. He had Philip, who was a half-brother of his, who was mentally deficient. He had a son, Alexander, that was born after he died. He was born post Alexander's death himself. And then he had another son, an illegitimate son, named Hercules. None of Alexander's descendants, just like it said hundreds of years before, not one of Alexander's descendants took his reign and his authority in his kingdom. So that gets us up to verse 5. Verses 5 through 20 cover a period of 323 BC all the way down to 176 BC. Let's just stop momentarily. God is telling a man, an humble servant, by the name of Daniel, way back in 539 BC, he's telling him through an angel that he sent to him because Daniel, in his humility, prayed for understanding about what would happen to God's people. God sends an angel to him, not to mention, as we covered last week, the great warfare between that angel actually getting to Daniel. The angel gets to Daniel, the messenger gets to Daniel, and he's telling him and sharing with him what's going to happen all the way to 164 BC. And history, secular history, not even theological or schools that set out history, secular history attests that all these things actually occurred. It's such a provocative statement that there was a man way back when that kind of set the course for liberal scholarship and questioning whether or not this really was written when it was written. He just couldn't wrap his mind around it. He said no one could ever tell the future with such precision as we find in Daniel chapter 11. It cannot have been written in the 6th century BC. It had to be written after the fact and disguised as it was as prophecy. Well, no man did tell this, but that God the Father spoke in inspiration. God was doing a magnificent thing here. Now, verses 5 through 20 speak about the Syrian division of these four different divisions of Alexander's empire and how they were parceled out in four different ways. It speaks of the Syrian division, which is just north of Palestine. Think the beautiful land, God's land, Jerusalem. Just north of there is the Syrian division, what will be referred to in these verses as the Seleucid kings. And the Egyptian division, which is just south of Palestine. The Egyptian division, which is just south of Palestine, is referred to as the Ptolemaic kings. So what you have in verses 5 through 20, you have just to the north of Palestine, where God's people are, just to the north. Remember, Daniel's concerned about what's happening to his people. The messenger says back in chapter 10, I believe it is verse 14, I've come to share with you these things, 14 or 18, I've come to share with you these things. And he's talking about God's people. So God's people, the Jewish people, are here, and they've gone back by this time. They're going back. They're back to Jerusalem, Judea, the beautiful land. They're there. Now the messenger is saying, okay, just north of there is Syria. This is the Seleucid kings. And just below, just south of Palestine, God's people, is the Ptolemaic kings, the Egyptian division. And these two divisions, the Syrians and the Egyptians, over the span of hundreds of years, about 150 years, they are going to war, watch this, against each other. Now, if they're in the north and then they're in the south, the Syrians are in the north, the Egyptians are in the south, and who gets caught in the middle? God's people. That's why God is telling Daniel about this. That's why years later, as Jewish Christians are going through this time, they're able to relate and say, okay, yeah, God's got this. He already told us what's going to happen. He told us there's going to be great wars. He tells in such precision. Let's look in verse 5. Verse 5 relates to 300 BC. Verse 5 relates to 300 BC. Then the king of the south will grow strong. The king of the south will grow strong. That's Ptolemy the first from Egypt, along with one of his princes, who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion. His domain will be a great dominion indeed. Actually, Seleucus the first was actually served under the guy that became the leader of the northern Syrian division. He actually served under Ptolemy at first. And then he goes and sets off on his own, and now he's in the northern kingdom, and you've got this battle, and he's greater than the one he served under in Egypt. So at this point, the northern king becomes stronger. Verse 6, after some years they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful agreement or a peaceful arrangement. But she will not retain her position of power, verse 6, nor will he remain with his power, but she will be given up, along with those who brought her in, and the one who sired her, as well as he who supported her during those times. So back at the top of verse 6, the daughter of the king of the south. So Ptolemy sends his daughter up to Antiochus, at this time, Antiochus II, who is now leading Syria in 250 BC. And he sends his daughter up there, Berenice. And he says, Berenice, I want you to go up there and I want you to pair with Antiochus, the leader, the king of the northern empire. That way we can have peace and have an agreement. And she's, okay. And he sends her up there. And she goes up there. And she is going to have a son with the northern king. And that son will become ruler of the northern kingdom. And now the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom will be unified in marriage and in hereditary nature. But the only problem is that Antiochus II already had a wife, right? He already had a wife by the name of Laodice. And she takes upon herself to murder this daughter. That's why she will not retain power, this Berenice in the middle of verse 6. She will not return to her position of power because she's murdered. She's murdered by Antiochus II's wife. He murders her. He murders the child they have and murders Antiochus himself. And now for a short time, Berenice is actually the queen or rules as the king over northern Syria. Now read to verses 7 through 9. One of his descendants of her line will arise in his place, and he will come against their army and enter the fortress of the king of the north. And he will deal with them and display great strength. And also their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold, he will take into captivity to Egypt. And he, on his part, will refrain from attacking the king of the north for some years. Then the latter will enter the realm of the king of the south, but he will not return to his own land. Verses 7 through 9 refer to 240 BC. 240 BC. And remember, Christ came about 3 BC. About 3 BC came during that time. So we're getting closer to the arrival of Christ. So verses 7 through 9, 240 BC, you have Seleucus II that is in the north and Ptolemy III that's in Egypt. Ptolemy attacks Syria, the north. Why? In revenge for his daughter being killed. He attacks him. And Seleucus, the north, recovers from this attack, actually attempts a quick invasion into Egypt. So you're seeing very quickly just all this discombobulation, these wars, and keep in mind who's in the middle. God's people. God's people are in the middle of these wars and these climbs for power. I don't watch Games of Thrones. I've never watched it. I never will. I just think it's outside parameters of what I should be watching. But I'm not condemning you, but you may know the story. And the basic story is that these kingdoms rise and fall, and the people are just clawing with ambition, and they want power and they want prestige. That's the same thing that's going on here. And God is telling Daniel, my people are going to be in the middle of all this. They're going to be right here in the middle of all of it. Verses 10 through 20 are a period of time from 226 BC all the way to 175 BC. In verse 10, let's look. And his sons will mobilize and assemble a multitude of great forces. And one of them will keep on coming and overflow and pass through, that he may again wage war up to his very fortress. So now we have the introduction of the father of the great prototypical Antichrist, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who we've talked about in length earlier in chapter 8. But here we have his father, Antiochus III, in the northern Syrian Empire. And he's going to do battle and war over a period of years with Ptolemy IV and Ptolemy V, who is actually a 6-year-old king in Egypt at that time. So verses 11 through 20 talk about this war, talk about how Antiochus III goes back and forth. And eventually Antiochus III, that is the northern empire, reigns over. Eventually, verse 15 through 16 tells us about a period of time from 199 BC to 198 BC where the Egyptian general from the south, the Ptolemaic kings, he finally succumbs to Antiochus and he finally surrenders. And now Antiochus has absolute power, authority, and control of the beautiful land. Look in verse 15. Then the king of the north will come. That is Antiochus III from the Seleucids, the Syrians. And he will cast up a siege mound and capture a well-fortified city, Antioch. And the forces of the south will not stand their ground, not even their choicest troops, for there will be no strength to make a stand. But he who comes against him will do as he pleases, and no one will be able to withstand him. He will also stay for a time in the beautiful land with destruction in his hand. Now he has complete control and authority over the beautiful land. Complete control and authority over the beautiful land inhabited by God's people. By God's people. Verses 18 through 19 tell us how Antiochus III eventually loses this kingdom. In 191, another biblical prophecy comes true. In 191 BC, the Romans and the Greeks, the Romans being the fourth great empire after the Greece empire, the Romans come and they partner with the Greeks to defeat Antiochus III. And they make him sign a treaty in 188 BC that says, I'm giving all this land to you, all this control to you. I'm giving my military, turning over hostages, even my son Antiochus IV. I'm going to pay a fine, and the fines that they called on him to pay were so exorbitant, it eventually led to his death. He had to go to the western coastlands out by the Mediterranean Sea to try to sack villages and sack people and steal from them. He was fairly successful in that. Antiochus III, upon coming back, he raids a pagan temple, and while he's there, the people protect the temple and they kill him. He's trying to get the money from that temple so he can pay the Romans off to stay in business, and they kill him while he's doing that. That brings us all the way to verse 20. Look at verse 20. Then in his place, that is Antiochus III, one will arise who will send an oppressor through the jewel of his kingdom, yet within a few days he will be shattered, though neither in anger nor in battle. Now listen closely. This is Seleucus IV, one of the two main sons of Antiochus III that has just died raiding a temple trying to get money to pay his fines. Seleucus IV inherits this kingdom, comes to power, and it's very short-lived, 187 to 175 BC. And in fact, the Bible says that his kingdom will be shattered, but not in anger nor in battle. How does Seleucus IV die? What does history tell us? How does Seleucus IV die? He did not die in battle. He did not die in anger. He died at the hand of his own tax collector and prime minister, Heliodorus, who poisoned him. That's how he died. And of course, God told Daniel this, how he would die, not in battle. He told him hundreds of years before it happened. All the way, this brings us to verses 21 through 35 in the years 175 BC through 164 BC. Now, God covers a great span of years in history, in his history lesson, given to Daniel, his history lesson. He covers a great deal in verses 2 through 20, a great deal. But you'll notice in verses 21 through 35, God's going to cover only about 12 years, but he's going to spend a significant amount on it. Why is that? Well, in those days, as the word was revealed, and then the spoken word and the narrative was taken and eventually put on paper, that's why we have a record of this. There wasn't, in your types of Word documents, when you really want something to stick out, you'll make the text larger or you'll put a bold print on it. There wasn't that option. So one of the techniques the ancient writers had is they would spend more time. If you saw a lot of verses and a lot of print on a certain subject, that meant this is extremely important. Pay attention to this. That's what's happening here in verses 21 through 35. 21 through 35. I want to read this in its entirety. I want to read verses 21 through 35 in its entirety. You're going to have to do great work to stay focused here. It is a lot of verses, but I want you to get the full effect. I don't want to break this down in pieces. I want you to get the full effect of who this prototypical Antichrist was and why God spends a significant amount of time on it. Beginning and really follow in to get the full grasp of it. Follow along in verse 21 in your copy of the scriptures. And in his place, a despicable, you're going to get the characteristics of the Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes. You're going to get the characteristics of who this guy is very quickly. And in his place, verse 21, a despicable person will arise, on whom the honor of kingship has not been confirmed. But he will come in a time of tranquility and he will seize the kingdom by intrigue. And the overflowing forces will be flooded away before him and shattered, and also the prince of the covenant. And after an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception. And he will go up and he will gain power with a small force of people. Verse 24, in a time of tranquility, he will enter the richest parts of the realm, and he will accomplish what his fathers never did, nor his ancestors. He will distribute plunder, booty, and possessions among them. And he will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. And he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south with a large army. So the king of the south will mobilize an extremely large and mighty army for war. But he will not stand, for schemes will be devised against him. And those who eat his choice food will destroy him, and his army will overflow, but many will fall down slain. As for both kings, their hearts will be intent on evil, and they will speak lies to each other at the same table. But it will not succeed, for the end is still to come at the appointed time. Verse 28, then he will return to his land with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant. And he will take action and then return to his own land. At the appointed time he will return and come into the south. But this last time it will not turn out the way it did before. For ships of Kittim will come against him. Therefore he will be disheartened and will return and become enraged at the holy covenant and take action. So he will come back and show regard for those who forsook the holy covenant. And forces, verse 31, with him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice. And they will set up the abomination of desolation. And by smooth words he will turn to godliness and those who act wickedly towards the covenant. But the people who know their God will display strength and will take action. And those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many. Yet they will fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. Now, when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join them, yet in hypocrisy. And some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. In verses 21 through 35, God shares with Daniel the most horrendous time of onslaught persecution of God's people up to this point known in the history of time. Greater than the slavery, the 400 years of slavery they endured in Egyptian rule, greater than anything that had ever happened. God says, Daniel, my people for a period here, we know now of 12 years, will undergo harsh, extremely harsh persecution. And why is he telling Daniel this? Why is he telling Daniel this to eventually get this out there to his people? Because God wants his people to know that He not always has them go around the fire in the trials, but oftentimes God allows them to go through the fire. And it's through the fire and through the perseverance that God molds and shapes his people into a character like he wants. Remember way back in Genesis when man was created in the image of God. They were created to live forever, created with this image that would reflect God. It reflects who God is and his character and being perfect. And man, we have destroyed that image. And so God set out a group of people, the Hebrew people, and he says, I'm going to rebuild this. I'm going to restore the wrong that happened way back in the garden. I'm going to do it through specific people, and I'm going to do it through the history of time. That's why Israel, even to this day, is so extremely important. The people of God, God's people, his chosen people, the Jews, are so extremely important. And God says, I'm going to take you through this trial, and I'm going to have my purpose, my word of truth will be done even through this. And you can imagine years later, if you were a Jewish person living during that time, having this horrendous man, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who at first you showered with praise as he came into the land. At first you thought this guy is going to be great. At first he gave you set out plunder, and he gave all these sorts of prizes and gifts to people, and you thought this is going to be great. But as he began to fight for himself, and not for others, but for himself and his own glory, and really extended to the glory of his god, who was Zeus, a pagan god, and he begins to fight. Remember, from the north, the fight is still going on with Egypt, even though he has the land. He's trying to secure that land, and he's fighting, going back and forth. And then he gets roughed up, and when he gets roughed up, he turns his anger, as oftentimes tyrants and dictators and people by the name of Adolf Hitler do. They turn their anger towards God's people. And that's what Antiochus IV did. He turned his anger and his rage towards God's people, the Jews, and began to systematically persecute them in a very atrocious way. The Bible tells us about some of these times. The Bible tells us that it's going to be a very, very bad time for God's people. Look there in verse 31 as we get ready to move on to the Antichrist. In verse 31, at the end of verse 31, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. It was at this time because, verse 30, these ships and these other groups, this coalition of Egyptian power had come against Antiochus IV, and he was so mad that he came back. And look, it says in the middle of verse 30, he became enraged at the Holy Covenant. That's God's people. And he takes action. He comes back and he takes action. Well, very strange at the end of verse 30, there's those that actually were part of the Holy Covenant that sided with Antiochus IV. That's a strange thing. They will get their due. But in verse 31, and from him forces will arise and desecrate the sanctuary fortress. So they go into the temple and they absolutely desecrate the temple of God and everything in there. Could you imagine marauders coming in right now through those doors and through these doors, seizing this place and flipping the tables over, tearing down the cross, putting pentagrams, painting graffiti pentagrams upon the cross, and doing any sorts of thing and just desecrating this place, right? This is not the temple of God. It's a place we meet. The body of Christ actually comes together to meet. Back then, it was representative of the place where God met his people and came down and entertained with his people. And they come in and they sack this place, all the way to where they sacrificed a pig upon the altar. If you were a Jew in that day and age, your heart would have been absolutely broken. Where is God? How could Almighty, Supreme, Sovereign God allow these things to happen in his temple? We allowed them to happen because all you had to do was go back and read the scripture in Daniel. And he told you hundreds of years before that it would happen and to be ready. Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, is an intensifying of God's description of man in verses 1 through 20. Selfish ambition, clawing, scratching to promote himself and to be the prototypical anti-Christ, anti being against Christ, against God, anti-God. If there was ever in the history of man up to this point someone who was against God and his people, it was Antiochus IV Epiphanes. That's why the Jewish people today, they still have a great holiday known as Hanukkah, for the time that God sent the deliverer, Judas, in the Maccabean revolt to put down Antiochus IV and to quash this. It's a very significant time. That leads us into the second part of chapter 11, verses 36 to 35, the end times, the identification, the characteristic, and the eventual desolation of the Antichrist. Verses 36 to 35, we will not read in a whole, but we will work through them as we go through each verse. Let's begin in verse 36. Then the king, this is not Antiochus IV, this is a new king. Now, verses 1 through 35, remember, they cover a specific time, 539 BC, all the way to 164. That's in the past. Now God is telling Daniel, hey, at the end of days, at the very end of days, this is what's going to happen. Then, verse 36, the king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god. He will speak monstrous things against the God of gods, and he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for which is decreed and will be done. Breaking down verse 36 really quickly. This Antichrist takes Antiochus IV Epiphanes to a whole new level. You thought it was bad with Antiochus IV Epiphanes and all the things that he did? The Antichrist, he makes Antiochus IV Epiphanes look like a little child. He takes it to a whole new level. He has no pretension. He does, verse 36, he does as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself. That's something Antiochus IV Epiphanes eventually did. That's where his title Epiphanes, that is the image of who he is. He had it placed on all the coins at that time, worshiping himself and then giving worship to Zeus. This guy, the Antichrist, he doesn't even bother trying to worship a pagan god. You'll see he does away with the gods of his previous. He doesn't do any of that. He is in and about himself and no other. He is in effect against the God of gods, in effect against the Christ, against God, against Christ. Verse 37, and he will show no regard for the gods of his father or for the desire of women. He's not given to the religious aspect of his. This is a real person, by the way. This is a real person, just like Antiochus IV Epiphanes was. This is a real corporal body, in effect, doing things. He's a real human being. He's a person. He will come about, and he won't give zero regard for gods. And zero regard for the gods of his fathers. He's not going to be affected by the nuclear family, by who God is and how God set up the nuclear family to work. He's not going to be attracted to the desire of women, nor will he show regard for any other god. Why? He will magnify himself above them all. The Bible tells us in Revelation, it talks about him in 2 Thessalonians, talks about the Antichrist. This guy is a smooth operator. On first sight, you would like this gentleman. You would think, man, this guy has charisma. He's got the looks. He's got the power. He's got the prestige. This guy, and there will be some that will follow him as sheep to slaughter. This guy has it all, and it's so much so, he magnifies himself above all other gods. This is not just Jehovah God. This is everything else. Muhammad, Buddha, teachings of Confucius. This is above everything. He says, in effect, I am the one I deserve. This is a single man in the future, perhaps in our day and age, in the future that will come and say, I am the greatest of any. I deserve all praise and glory. And hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people will follow him and say, yeah, you are. You think it's crazy? It will happen. Verse 38. But instead, he will honor a God of fortresses. You say, what's that? I thought you just said he doesn't honor God. God of fortresses, a God whom his father did not know. He will honor him, that is the God of fortresses, with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures. Most scholars believe that this is the God of fortresses. This means kingdom building. So the Antichrist is here, and he's here for a purpose. He is here to come against Christ and his kingdom. The Antichrist is here with cunning, with manipulation, with selfish ambition to rule the world. To rule the world. One man is coming, and he will be born of a woman, and he will come, just as you and I are sitting here today, and he will come and set up shop to rule the entire world. And so he has a heart. He has a heart for self and heart to rule the world and for praise and glory to come to him. So he will use gold, silver, costly stones, treasures, anything he can to build up his kingdom. Verse 39, he will take action against the strongest of fortresses with the help of a foreign god. That is one that has not been in place yet. And a foreign god will come alongside him and help him. And he will give great honor to those who acknowledge him. To those who say, yeah, you're the guy, you're magnificent, you're awesome. We worship you. We're following you. He's going to give honor to them. He's going to pay them off, if you will. And he will cause them to rule over many, and he will parcel out the land for a price. He will give them plunder, and he will give them responsibility, but it will come at a price of their souls, by the way. Verse 40. And at the end of time, moving quickly into verses 40 through 45, verses 40 through 45 illuminate the battle of Armageddon. This is it. This is it. This is what the history of man has always, since this time, this prophetic message into the history of man. This is what people have been concerned of. You go back and you look, there's a whole genre of art that is based upon the Battle of Armageddon. This thing is what people want to know about. What's going to go on? Well, he tells us in verses 40 through 45. And at the end time, the king of the south will collide with him. So the thought is here, the king of the south, the Ptolemaic kingdom, one of the ancient kingdoms of the world, the Egyptian kingdom, that they will have a coalition of power from the south, and then the king of the north will storm against him. So here, the king of the south and the king of the north are coming against the Antichrist. This is the battle of all battles. They're coming against him with chariots, with horsemen, and with many ships. And he will enter countries, and he will overflow them and pass through. So as mighty as these powers are, this coalition of forces, these people, these nations, these countries that come against the Antichrist, he just floods over them like knife through butter. Nothing. Verse 41, and he will also enter the beautiful land. Oh, that's what the Antichrist wants. He wants to come and to reclaim and to set up shop where God's people are in God's land that he promised to Abraham. Because he's Antichrist, he's anti-God, he's setting himself up as a capitulation of all human existence, pride, selfish ambition, and here he is exonified in the person of the Antichrist against God and everything God stands for. And he comes to the beautiful land. Many countries will fall, but these will be rescued out of his hand: Edom, Moab, and the foremost are the leaders of the sons of Ammon. God even tells us that in the future, these places around the Jordan here, these places, they're gonna help him in some regard, so he's not going to annihilate them. Verse 42, then he will stretch out his hand against other countries, and the land of Egypt will not escape. So he's going to tear Egypt apart, gain control of that. Verse 43, but when he, the Antichrist, will gain control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver. Some believe the hidden treasure refers to the great wealth of oil, the hidden treasure of gold and silver. Some people believe that. And over the precious things of Egypt, and Libyans and Ethiopians will follow at his heel. He's going to subdue all the Fertile Crescent, all of that. He's subduing all of it. He's taking over the main part, and what we know to be true. That's why the wars still continue there. The epicenter of the universe over there in the promised land, the beautiful land. He's taken all that over in the fertile region, crescent around there. But, verse 44, but rumors from the east and the north will disturb him. So as he's progressing, he is disturbed that there's something coming from the east and the north. And he will go forth with great wrath to destroy and annihilate many. Thousands upon thousands of people will be killed by this man. It will be his responsibility. Their blood will be upon his hand. He will annihilate and destroy many. Verse 45, and he will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion. In the ancient days, when a king was on campaign, he would take along with him this great grand tabernacle of a tent there, like the tabernacle, a huge tent, and he would set it up, and that would be where he would reign, his regency, and then there would be smaller tents all the way around with his attendants to help him and his counsel and all that. So he's going to do that. The Bible tells us that he will pitch his tents of his royal pavilion between the seas, that is the Mediterranean seas to the west, and to the east the Dead Sea, and the beautiful mountain, that is Mount Zion. Do you see how specific God is being Hundreds, at least 2,000 years before it happened. And if it extends further, way before. God is telling Daniel, this will happen, this will occur. The end of verse 45, yet he will come to his end. And no one will help him. No one will help him. As magnificent and as mighty and influential and powerful as the Antichrist is, it only takes two phrases at the end of a verse to tell of his demise. There happens to be another man who comes from the eastern sky and destroys the Antichrist and his prophet and takes them and throws them into the lake of fire. We'll see that next week. You don't want to miss chapter 12. You'll be here next week. It's going to be a good week. We've worked all the way to get to chapter 12. A beautiful week. So today, God has taught us. I mean, we could literally, and I thought about it, about breaking chapter 11 into 3 or 4 week series. You could do that very easily. You could spend a year probably. But today we've seen from a distance the main points of Daniel chapter 11. And God has taught us a lesson in world history. He's taught us a lesson in world history. He's taught us in verses 1 through 35 what have occurred. And he's taught us in verses 36 through 45 what will occur. Now, very quickly, we want to extract the biblical truth from verses 1 through 35. That's the first part. And then apply it to our lives. And then extract the biblical truth from verses 36 to 45 and apply it to our lives. So the overarching biblical truth, the nugget, the treasure, God's truth, what we are to take from verses 1 through 35 are in regard to the omniscience of God. Omniscience, omni, all, science there is a combo word there to say all-knowing. Verses 1 through 35 share with us that God knows everything. That God knows everything. The precision of prophecy in verses 1 through 35 are off the charts. You see prophetic language all over the Bible. You see it different times. Nothing like you see with detail, precise detail in verses 1 through 35. In verses 1 through 35 of chapter 11, there are 135 prophecies that have been literally fulfilled and may be checked out with a study of secular history of that time. In the first 35 verses, 135 prophecies that were told hundreds of years before they happened, and they were literally fulfilled. You can check it with Britannica, whoever you want to check it, it happened exactly like God said it was going to happen hundreds of years before it happened. God knows everything. And what's our application? It's very simple. Complete trust of God. God knows everything. I trust Him with everything. God knows everything. I completely trust Him with everything. I trust Him with the history of the world. I trust Him with the 70th week. I trust Him with the tribulation. I trust Him with the battle of Armageddon. I trust Him with all my finances. I trust Him with all my relationships. I trust Him with my career. He knows everything. He's my God. He's good. He knows everything. I trust Him with everything. That's your application for verses 1 through 5. You leave today and say, hey, He knows everything. 135 prophecies literally fulfilled in 35 verses told hundreds of years before. He knows everything. I'm going to trust Him today with everything. The truth, the biblical truth that we extract from verses 36 through 45 is this. The omnipotence of God. That is, He is all powerful. He even used Antiochus IV Epiphanes and the Antichrist. He used them in their rebellion and their selfishness to purge and to bring out something beautiful in His regard to truth. Through all of this, the Jewish nation, Israel, will be saved. And God's truth in His promises that He gave to them with the Abrahamic covenant and all the extended covenants from there, the Davidic, all those things. God's word will come true. And he will use even the most evil things that what were meant for evil, he will use them in his power and control to bring about good. You see, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, where is he now? He's gone. As great as the Antichrist will be, and he will be great, his time will come to an end and no one will help him. It's nothing for God to take him down. So, verses 1 through 35, the omniscience of God, God's all-knowing, so we completely trust him. Verses 36 through 45, the omnipotence, the all-powerful, the power of God. He's all-powerful. He has complete power over everything at all times. God's all-powerful. So what is our application of that truth that God's all-powerful? It's complete confidence in him. Complete trust and then complete confidence. So you leave today knowing no matter what you face in your life, in the United States of America, in the world, in your home, no matter what you face trials, you have complete trust that God knows. And you have complete trust in him. And you have complete confidence in God. And that's what God wants from his children. The Jewish children that this word was originally written to, and to his children, you and I today, through the blood of Christ. A closing observation and we're done. This entire chapter, these kings up, down, these kings, the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, all these different kings, the second, the third, Bernice, Laodiceas, all these different kings, the Antiochus IV, even his dad, the third, the great, all these things, and the Antichrist himself, they showcase the heart of mankind. That at our heart, we are selfish, we are manipulative, we are obstinate, we are jealous, and even at times we lack in our belief and faith of God. Far be it for a son or daughter of Jehovah God to live their lives with the same characteristics that are used to describe the Antichrist. Far be it for you and I this morning to live our lives selfishly, manipulative, obstinate, jealous, and even at times lacking in faith. Christians that live like the world are to be pitied, and perhaps they even need to be saved. A lesson in world history. If Coach Olson brought you a quiz, a matching quiz, and he listed out the characteristics of the Antichrist: selfish, self-serving, bitter, angry, jealous, loathsome, vindictive, manipulative. And then he listed out the characteristics of Christ: loving, kind, enduring, pure, righteous, holy. And he says, I want you to draw a line matching yourself to either the characteristics of the Antichrist or to Christ. If you had to draw that line today, who would you match up with?